Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. In France, former Prime Minister François Fillon has won the right to have the Conservative Party ticket in next year's French presidential election. With his win, concern about an in-out EU referendum has been raised again. Indeed, after Brexit, a kind of referendum fever has spread across the EU, with Italy, Denmark, the Netherlands and other countries in the EU expressing at least some degree of desire for a change. But do referendums contribute to the development of democracy or provide a platform for radical parties across the continent to pursue their own agendas? What are the factors fueling dissatisfaction with the EU? And will integration and the benefits of the EU ultimately win out over populist and nationalist sentiment? To discuss these and other issues, I'm very much pleased to be joined in the studio by Frank Sirion, a columnist for Handelsblatt, and Perez Garcia, Associate Professor in the Department of International Politics of the School of International Studies, Renmin University of China. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a quick look at this.
After Brexit, referendum fever sweeps Europe. In Italy on December 4th, citizens voted no in the referendum, which was intended to overhaul the constitution. Prime Minister Matteo Renzi had insisted on reforms to streamline Italy's lawmaking process, which he considered key to kickstarting the country's economy. After losing the vote, Renzi announced his resignation as promised. In France, more people are in favour of holding their own vote on EU membership than are opposed. Marine Le Pen, leader of the hard-right Eurosceptic party Front National, vows to make possible a referendum if she gets elected. And a slew of other European countries, such as Austria, Sweden and the Netherlands, all have anti-EU forces within them, calling for national votes on whether or not to leave the European Union. Many throughout the political spectrum acknowledge that radical change is called for to counter what's seen as a rising tide of populism and nationalism on the continent, but suggest that referendums are actually more likely to encourage that rise.
Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. Let's look at what's happening in Europe. Europe seems to be experiencing a referendum fever, starting with the Brexit on June the 23rd, followed by the refugee quota referendum in Hungary and the constitutional amendment referendum in Italy. On the surface, the referendum is a formidable tool for democracy. On the other hand, more and more are increasingly questioning the integrity of referendum because few would regard each and every voter to be rational when they use the ballot box. What do you think of our concerns?
It's a very difficult topic. On one side, we need to listen to the voters, and we need to take their ideas seriously. And I think a lot of these so-called populist votes are expressing the insatisfaction with some developments within the political elite. On the other side, you're right, we're talking about very complicated topics. And some of these topics we can't be solved if you're saying yes or no. So, but the most important thing is that we do take the votes as a serious matter.
Now, Mr. Garcia, do you first of all believe the referendum is something legitimate that can ultimately decide policy making?
Yeah, of course, it's a legitimate way to allow people to express their ideas, but on the other side,
Excuse me, are you saying that the referendum is used in most cases to express ideas or, ironically, sentiment? Because there is a great difference and distance between opinion or informed opinions and public sentiment.
That is the question, that is the point, is the sentiment or the resentment of the population. Take the example, for instance, the recent elections at the US. Many people why vote Trump, many of those that were not supposed to vote him, like the Latino community, vote for Trump because there is this huge development and discontent with the Washington elite, and since the late 70s with the desindustrialization in the US, that the middle class has been progressively disappeared and lost purchasing power. So salaries becoming lower, prices, inflation higher. So this context express.
Yes.
The problem is,
Frank.
if people vote what I want, it's democracy. If people don't vote what I want, it's populism. That makes it so difficult.
But first of all, do you think populism is a kind of democracy?
That's a very difficult question, because
Is
what
it true that the way you
populism?
like it, it's democracy? Way you dislike it, whatever expression of public opinions is not populism.
That is the idea of
populism. It's not democracy.
That is the idea of democracy, that people can express their ideas and their political view.
So therefore, do we have a division about the bad democracy and the good democracy?
I will take the point of whether that populism, again, is legitimate. Of course, it's legitimate, the referendum, but populism, we need to think about the origin of the term. Where does it come from? It's about the people, the power vested from the nation to the people to elect their politicians.
Government
the
of the
leaders.
people, for the people, and by the people. Therefore, expression of public opinion would be the most important barometer for policy making. Is that your point?
Yeah, that is my point. But my point also, it goes from the education, because, you know, populism was born in Latin America, late 50s, in which they expressed this anger about the elite, the radical right elite ruling the country. Therefore, it was a wing that came from over Latin America, from Cuba until Argentina, and then flew to Europe. Therefore, it's a damage.
Frank, yes.
My idea is quite simple. People need to vote, but people don't need to vote all the time. So my idea of democracy would be that there's a vote, then there's a government, and then the government has to be powerful enough to bring things on the ground, to bring the politics on the ground, and after a certain amount of time, which should be not too short, people could vote again. But for me, from my point of view, it makes no sense to vote every year or every half year.
Frank is dangerously alluding to the alleged integrity of strongman politics. Look at Vladimir Putin, who was voted into office, and he now enjoys approval rating of up to 86%, despite the poor economic performance in Russia. And we also have a strongman in the Philippines, President Duterte. Also, Trump, the president-elect in the United States, is also described as a strong man. So are you saying that after the elections, the strong and the tough political will of the elected leader would count?
It's not so much about the strength of the politician, it's about the power to change things. It's about what Renzi tries to achieve with the referendum. He wants to gain more power to change things. And I totally agree, because now in Italy you have a very strong Senate, so every province, every region can stop the politics of the central government.
But given the,
that makes no sense.
Given the very controversial results of the presidential election in the United States, elite designers about democracy a couple of centuries back or earlier had forecast the consequences of majority tyranny. Right? You do not suppose that each voter would be reasonable and rational. I have said earlier in my questions, there would be the issue of a sentiment instead of informed opinions. And therefore, people turn to elites for their sophistication and wisdom in generating the public policies.
But how do you want to decide who's smart and who's not smart? That's very difficult.
Politically incorrect to say so on the media.
Yeah. But then you need to decide. You need to decide you can vote and you cannot vote. How you want to do this? This is not possible. Therefore, it's much more pragmatic to say people should vote, but not all the time and not about every topic. But definitely they should decide who's running a country.
Let's face up to the realities in Europe. Now, people are wondering aloud what the prospects might hold for the future of the European Union following the Brexit. One after another, political forces have expressed their desire to some degree of a change, a major change in the political landscape of continental Europe. What would be the worst case scenario?
Well, I remember that actually a year ago, the three of us were discussing here about the future of the integration of Europe with the migrant crisis. And it is really good that today we are in a kind of short midterm perspective, analyze what happened then and today about the future of Europe. But the thing is that with the changes and the post-Brexit, many people in the UK realize about the potential danger, and actually the elite or Cameron or the anti-Brexit were playing a very risky game. Now many people is disagreeing, and they really want to stay for Europe. Europe, at the end of the day, what it is, let's face it, it is a business, right? It's a good business that we need to participate, a common trade area, common currency, free movement people. We are in a global period in which should we go back to our old national system? And actually this populist movement is not new. 20s and 30s in the 20th century, we have all these movements when authoritarian regimes emerged in Europe. Italy, Germany, Spain.
I think the trouble we have now is because the politicians, for a long time, they didn't listen to the people. They kind of separated from the people.
They listened to the elite media.
Whatever they listened to.
And voices of these
and now the people are kind of fed up.
Are you divorced from the new reality because they seriously ignore the social media?
The social media is a very important thing to listen to. You don't have to take everything for true, that's for sure, but to get an impression why the people are angry, it's a very good idea to listen to it. And I think what we now need to do, we need to get back to the people and see what they want, and to separate those things which are possible from those which are not possible or which are bad for the future of Europe, and then try to find a synergy or try to find a compromise to do reforms in Europe to get Europe on the track again.
Mr. Garcia, don't you think it's far from enough just to say social media is important? Actually, Hillary Clinton has been punished ruthlessly for ignoring the use of social media, and in fact this President-elect Donald Trump has been fully able to use the social media for his policy announcement following the campaign success, bypassing the elite traditional media. Mm-hmm. What does that mean for the future of the world?
Well, seems actually in modern politics, in the modern world, the social media has played a very crucial role. Things about, for instance, how unexpectedly Kennedy won elections against Nixon, and media in the US are really important to run a campaign. The thing about Trump, he got the favor that he is a owner, an entrepreneur, so he's funding himself for a campaign. So that is another important issue to take into account. But again, for the case of Italy, for instance, I was reading this morning at the Corriere della Sera, one of the most important newspaper in Italy, that Beppe Grillo and the Cinque Stelle, five-star movement, have also some, there is, these rumors about some connections, some blogs, spreading the ideas, being pro-Putin, pro-Russia, and therefore they have received this criticism from Renzi and the opposition and their party. So populism, the thing is that, again, it's about education. And today we should, more and more in this new globalization or redefinition of globalization, get rid of ideology and think that politicians, our leaders, are our managers, like running the economy of our big family, which is the country. Therefore, we should stick more to facts, and then truth comes from facts, not stay all this funny and easy solutions.
You are talking about the integrity of good journalism, seeking truth from facts.
Yes, but it's more complicated. I think the big mistake the elite media did, that they thought democracy has no disadvantages. This was kind of a position they didn't walk behind. But everything has disadvantages. And if you elect all the times, it has disadvantages as well. But there was no such discussion. And over the years, people felt the disadvantages. And probably what we have to do now is to further develop democracy, in probably saying, like in Germany, we shouldn't vote every 6 months on provincial level, but we should put all the elections on one date.
Are you suggesting clearly that elite intellectuals and policymakers have been held hostage ruthlessly by being politically correct, and the issue of pretensions, hypocrisy? They are very reluctant to discuss the disadvantages of democracy. Most when China talks about the disadvantages of the social group, they say, hey, your regime does not respect human rights.
But I'm not sure if they are hostages. It probably has to do with our history in Europe, that we had an Iron Curtain. And there was this idea of, on one side there's dictatorship, on the other side there's democracy.
Sorry, we have to leave you there for the moment. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Frank Siren and Mr. Manuel Garcia. We are discussing ramifications and consequences of referendum. Is that bad democracy? Or what about the double-edged sword of using referendum and the ballot box? We'll be back in a few minutes. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Frank, what do you want to say about the future of globalization?
It probably has to do with our history, because there was this Iron Curtain and there was this fight about systems. And we learned democracy is good and dictatorship is bad. And in the case of Soviet Union, it was actually true. But now we are in different circumstances. And probably China needs a bit more democracy, and we probably need a bit less democracy. But the most important thing is we need to discuss about it. We need to discuss openly about the advantages and disadvantages of democracy, or of the ability to do politics again in being able, running for, let's say, 5 years without any interference by voters.
Now, gentlemen, it's politically correct and safe to say, okay, we have a bad democracy and in most cases a good democracy. We have a benevolent empire and evil empire, the former Soviet Union, in words of Ronald Reagan, for example. But can we say we have a good dictatorship and bad dictatorship? Bad dictatorship means a totalitarian regime, but good dictatorship means autocracy. However, for the West, few would openly argue about the integrity of a good dictatorship. I mean, that'll draw scathing scrutiny and
you know,
fire from the media.
From the, actually, again, from the, we should go back and take seriously history, our recent history in the 60s. In Europe, dictatorship, of course, was seen really bad, but they have glimpses and they sympathize with left dictatorship. In the 60s, the Che Guevara movement, Cuba. So the left side, left parties in Europe from that period until now, they are sympathizing quite a lot with all those movements and then criticizing the right. I'm not putting the question that right, left is good or not, but the result, we should look at, as your question was made, which type of dictatorship or system is good, but actually in economic terms we should take result. Yeah, think about Cuba.
I would put it on a more practical level than talking about good and bad dictatorship. For example, what I admire in China is that they do have a plan, and they try to go in a certain direction, and there's a decision about the direction. This is probably very important for America, it's very important for Europe. But that's not so much about good and bad dictatorship. It's about being able to go into a certain direction.
Take decisions.
Well, I'm afraid that dictatorship or democracy are just the symbols, right?
Yes.
The loaded concepts about different forms of governance and political institutions. Some of the practical guys in China say, hey, don't call me a conservative or a dictator. I prefer to have what works for China. okay, regardless of ideology. But today, if you look at American exceptionalism or what happened since 9/11 is a crusade against perhaps the politicization of Islamism. I mean, this is an issue of ideology. And with the end of the Cold War, do you think ideology should also serve to tell the differences as it did during the Cold War? I mean, will that be more harmful than good for
actually, we have that
global governance?
We have that debate at the early 90s with Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, the
last man at the end of history. He says liberal democracy prevails.
We are reviving.
Has he been proved wrong?
Yeah, and also Huntington, the class of civilization. So we are now, actually, he was predicting what was happening in 2001, 11 September, and today. We are not now focusing on nations, but the conflicts about civilization, Sunni civilization, Western, Islamic, and then how to make this balance. And actually, I think this is the point. I also Frank's statement. China has a plan. Europe, when changing from left to right party, we are always changing plans. For instance, about foreign affairs policy, there is not a concrete plan. China, what does have China? 中国特色国际化, internationalization with Chinese characteristics. So we should keep our sovereignty, of course, Italy, Spain, France, but we need to acknowledge about the global system we are in and the European Union. We need to have a strong
gentlemen,
European Union.
let me call your attention to this core issue by the end of the day. Through the use of referendum in Europe, for example, people are talking about whether traditional borders of a nation state should be respected or the other way around. Since 1648, the Westphalian document about the present-day diplomacy, people overwhelmingly support the idea of sovereignty. And today, with the globalization and the momentum of integration, economic and political alike, it seems traditional borders are disappearing. However, with the refugee crisis and the rise of terrorism in continental Europe, politicians in Central and Eastern Europe, in particular, are talking about the resumption of the traditional borders.
Yes, but then we shouldn't talk about borders, we should talk about solving the refugee problem. That's a different topic. People are not afraid about borders. People are afraid about too many
Excuse me,
people.
Frank. The issue of terrorism is a very complicated one, but the use of referendum can reduce complexity to the yes or no in black and white terms. So that will be quite simple. For politicians, that will be easy, piece of cake. Why don't we use a referendum?
Because you can't use referendum all the time and for every topic.
But that is what's happening in continental Europe. They are using referendum.
They are using referendum.
You represent elites, I'm afraid.
They're using
and
more
your
referendum than
representation
before.
of elitism has been seriously laughed at
look
in
at-
the US presidential election.
But again, look at Italy. They're doing a referendum to have more power, to have less referendums afterwards, and to be able to implement politics. What my idea of democracy is, there has to be a broad discussion about the direction where we would like to go, but then at a certain point you have to give the government a chance to implement this policy without being disturbed all the time by more referendums.
Frank evasively refused to answer directly my question about whether we're going to return to the traditional border of nation state.
I would
What's
say
your
no.
take? No.
No.
My take directly, referendum is not solution, of course, and we create instability. Therefore, the thing is that social media too powerful, as you mentioned.
But number 10 of Downing Street has said explicitly there's no future about the further integration. That's why the outcome of the Brexit vote.
But I will think
do
that.
you think this is a symbolic political gesture for most other countries where you have political forces who argue, hey, it's high time to give a second thought?
But Downing Street doesn't play any role anymore in Europe. They are out.
But I believe that this will not break down Europe. On the contrary, it will make the elite, the bureaucrats of Brussels, to think and make a self-critique what we are doing wrong. Actually, my idea of democracy, of our leaders, is not, again, put away about ideology, and in each ministry, education, foreign affairs, have the people specialized in that area. Then you can run better the country. take as an example, I will take always as an example Kennedy administration. He put the best team around him. A leader cannot do things by himself. You should be surrounded by the best, and the best who sometimes, in many cases take unpopular decisions. But those unpopular decisions in the mid-long term have a real good effect in society, and that was happening in the 60s with these social movements in US, the danger of a nuclear war with Cuba.
Now, gentlemen,
Vietnam
to
War.
conclude our brainstorming here, I've got the rough feeling that Frank somehow represents realism and utopianism about getting rid of ideology. That's mission impossible for the United States. I mean, they look at China in black and white terms. They look at China in black and white terms. Say this is a communist regime, this is a communist party, this is a violation of human rights. Whatever your achievements, they would say, hey, this is a very bad leadership
But I
of
didn't
a
talk
strong
about black
communist
and white.
ideology. This is their
I was
argument.
actually saying there are advantages in China and there are advantages in Europe, in Western countries. And we need to discuss it. That's, I think, that's still a big problem. There need to be an open and non-ideological discussion about advantages and disadvantages of different systems. And what we can't do is say one system is good and the other is bad. That's stupid.
You put your finger on a very, very important point. That is whether we have a universal principle or we should respect more cultural diversity and give other governments and the political institutions more space for their experiments,
But that's
for
black
them
and
to
white as
navigate
well.
their own course independently
That's black-
without being lectured.
But we
That's
need to be
black and
careful
white as
about
well.
experiments, because sometimes experiments, when are not doing in a proper way, we can have more internal problems, discussions in any country when there is instability, more class.
I
Well-
would say, sure, there are global values, but sure, there are cultural differences. But we do need to agree on common global values. But until now, what I do miss is discussion about it, including India, including China, including Africa, including the West. This is a discussion about global values we have to do.
Yes, we
and
do.
we can't
This is
say,
a discussion about global values, but
Yeah.
not about the end of history. Thank you very much for your participation in this enlightening discussion about referendum, which is becoming very controversial for an audience the world over. Thank you very much for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.